So Ariel, we're up here in Bodega.
Mm-hmm.
What's the ranch? How many cattle do you have? And what's kind of the vision for the ranch as you see it?
Sure. Well, this is one half of Freestone Ranch in Sonoma County. So there's a couple land holdings down here near the coast. So as you mentioned, this is, we're just between Bodega and Bodega Bay. We're about a couple miles from the coast right now. This has about 40 animal units right now, and an animal unit is about a 1,000-pound animal. So with my grazing planning, I tend to think in terms of animal units as opposed to number of animals, because that tells me what the forage requirement for the herd is actually going to be. And we're in the process of kind of moving animals around and figuring out the best way to use these two land bases, which are just a few miles apart, but pretty different in their some of their weather trends and their forage quality. We want to see how we can have these two ranches really work together and complement each other to support the grass-fed beef program in keeping with our ecological goals as well. So Freestone's other property here in Sonoma County is just a few miles east of here. And that has just sort of a different array of management considerations. So being so close, we can move animals back and forth, but we're really trying to think about what's the best way to have, you know, a certain class of animal on each to make management easier, but also, you know, make it easier for us to achieve our production goals, but also these kind of outstanding ecological ambitions that Freestone Ranch has.
You know, in terms of ecological ambitions, how do you view the importance of grazing animals on a landscape like this? There's a lot of brown in the background that people see on camera here.
Mm-hmm.
I'd consider it brittle. At least it looks like that to me. What's your view on how cattle impact a landscape like this?
Sure, yeah. Well, as you mentioned, it's pretty brown out here. All of the grasses are brown. There are some perennial grasses this time of year that will still have some, you know, green but dormant foliage, but pretty much everything's dormant, especially the annual grasses, which are dead. There's a few green forbs that are still growing. You know, this right now we're in late August 2018, and so we're kind of right in the middle of our dormant period. You know, it's been a few months since we got rain, and we're still hopefully just a couple months out of getting more rain. What's interesting here is that because we don't have rainfall from approximately April to October, really all of this forage will only break down either through fire, you know, the chemical breakdown, through just weathering and oxidation from exposure to, you know, UV rays or exposure to wind and ambient fog or mist, or through mechanical impact. So that could be like, you know, mowing a grassland or a pasture, or the act of trampling or driving over it, or biologically. And the best way to break down grass biologically in these historical native prairie areas is in the rumen of an animal. So cattle have huge rumen, they have a big capacity, and they're not endemic to this area, but they're a pretty good proxy for some of the native herbivores like elk that would typically be out here if we had not crowded them out, you know, through historical land management trends. So basically, when a cow, being a ruminant, takes a bite of grass, through their digestive process, they are able, they have the gut microbes to be able to break down all the cellulose and lignin and glean energy and nutrients from it for their own bodies, but also yield it back to the grassland ecosystem in the form of, you know, some in their urine, but mostly in their manure. And so they're taking this dry, dormant, oxidizing, kind of passively oxidizing grass, running it through their system and contributing back these little wet, you know, micro bombs onto the grassland. And if you flip them over, even if they're a little old, you see there's so much life underneath. We've got a really active dung beetle population. You'll see new plants start to grow and germinate. You'll see little mycelial threads start to emerge just in the moisture alone. And then, of course, once we get rain, that stuff will break down even faster. But even during this dormant period, they're basically inoculating the landscape with just more life. And that's important, not just because it's a surplus, but actually grasses cannot keep growing if they have the last year's growth on top of them. And that happens a couple ways. I mean, certainly annual grasses simply can't germinate if they don't have enough exposure to light or moisture, especially sunlight, because they have all of this old thatch on top of them. And perennial grasses need some of that old thatch cleared off, but they actually really actively benefit from having foliage removed. It triggers this whole chain of events that causes them to grow bigger and better than they would otherwise would be if they weren't grazed, especially if they are given appropriate rest periods. So that's, where planned grazing comes in, is we're planning the impact, whether through trampling or herbivory, but also what happens after the impact, which is where you get the full circle of plant recovery and, a truly restorative ecosystem in time.
So given what you have to work with here as a grazer, you're doing this for a business.
Right.
It's not just ecological restoration. What tools do you have in the grazing toolkit to enhance and advance the ecosystem and put weight on the cattle?
Sure. It's a great question. Well, herbivory is one tool, as I described. So that's basically going to be the act of animals grazing, the act of them removing vegetation for all those reasons, clearing up light and stimulating new growth. And then, of course, on the other side of their herbivory, their feeding behavior, is the returning of nutrients in their dunging and urination. So that's another tool. Another tool that we like to talk about that's separate from grazing is animal impact. So that's basically everything that's going on aside from the removal of vegetation. So dunging and urination is part of animal impact, but so is just the trampling, just the act of these 1,000+ pound animals stepping on forage, breaking down old, brittle, decaying stuff so that it can decay faster, pushing aside decadent grasses so that the crown of the perennial plants underneath are exposed to sunlight and can keep growing. That's all part of animal impact. Another thing we're learning a lot more about is just the act of, cattle saliva on the plants, especially during times when we have more rainfall or more moisture. That interacts with the soil in a way where we're finding that there's a lot of sort of life processes in grasslands that depend not just on the animal impact in the form of trampling and defecation, and not just on the grazing, but needs that microbial bomb from the saliva of the animal as well. So those are that's kind of the two halves of cattle on a landscape, right? Is animal impact and grazing. And I should say this is, I do consider this a kind of brittle environment. Not so much as places with a lot lower rainfall or more concentrated rainfall. We don't have the same problem, though, of like severely capped soil that you see in some areas where, places, maybe stretches of grass will need animals to break open that cap. If anything, we have to manage for the opposite. We have to make sure that we're not getting that sort of cow pan from having too many animals on too wet soil without appropriate recovery. But there are places that will have a bit of a hard pan that benefit from some impact, but it's usually we're managing for over impact. So in terms of cattle on a landscape, those are the main tools that I have to work with that I can think of right now. I guess on the other side of that, though, is just the rest and recovery periods. So I basically build my grazing plan from an ecological perspective around the plants that we want to promote. So I'm thinking, what's the soil condition like to promote the native perennial grasses that we want? In grassland ecosystems, we want to go a little more fungal. In places that are overgrown with scrub or non-native trees like encroaching conifers or eucalyptus, oftentimes we want to bring the soil to a more bacterial kind of part of the spectrum, because the grasses of seeds need certain range and certain soil profile, or certain set of characteristics to even germinate, right? So sometimes introducing animals to a place that's really overgrown with perennials can help stimulate new grasses to grow. Other times to arrive there, we need to be laying down a lot more thatch and litter so that the soil is less oxygenated and exposed and is more covered and has basically more kind of leaf mold breaking down into it. But yeah, rest and recovery is really important. And a metaphor I like to share when I talk about that is that, if you go to the gym and work out really hard, and use muscles you haven't used for a while, the next day or two, you're going to feel pretty sore. And if you go back to the gym 2 days later, when your body is still, getting the memo that it needs to allocate nutrients to these muscle groups you haven't used in a while, you can make yourself sick. You can cause serious strain or long-term damage if you overwork yourself. And similarly, if grasses are grazed too soon, which is kind of the definition of overgrazing in the sort of holistic management world, if they are grazed and then starting to recover, so using all their stored root energy to put on new growth, and grazed again before they can start to photosynthesize, then it's the same as if you went back to the gym for some, 90-minute workout too soon, right? You are then going to be set way further back than if you were grazed and allowed to fully recover, right. In which case you're actually going to be bigger and stronger and badder than you were if you were not grazed. Another thing to think about that is, we're learning a lot about the liquid carbon pathway, which is the way that grazed plants interact with the, fungal hyphae and microbes around them to attract nutrients and, exchanging carbohydrates for nutrients and pumping, carbohydrates, CO2 into the soil. But also just the act of having animals proximal to those native plants, those bunch grasses, can help to fertilize them, right? Because they're oftentimes dunging in some concentrated spots, but cattle are peeing in a more dispersed way. So even if it doesn't seem like a plant has been interacting with cattle, if it urinated 3 feet away, that's going to find its way to that plant after a while. It'll take a while for that nutrients to be bioavailable during dormancy, but especially once rain hits, or if it happens during the rainy season, then you start to get really fast recovery. So I think a lot of how we talk about cattle is in terms of mitigating or managing their impact, but we really need to be mindful that the presence of ruminants, cattle, domestic or wild, is completing a life cycle for plants, and it's also giving back. It's making available nutrients that the plant couldn't access otherwise, and that's how we get ahead,
right,
as opposed to just kind of treading water ecologically.
So let's use some imagination here. Mm-hmm. If you grazed cattle how you wanted, based on your understanding of this land mm-hmm. and their impact, and we fast forward ahead 20 years mm-hmm. or 50 years, some time period far into the future, mm-hmm. what do you think you'd see different?
Great question. If I were grazing the way I wanted and had my druthers and would really be able to impact the land exactly how I hoped, a few things come to mind. I think that the areas that have nothing really going on besides grass plants and forbs would have more trees and shrubs. I really believe in the value of trophic diversity, so to speak, in grasslands. And so that's like more things eating more things, right? So there's a biodiversity component, but there's also like a functional component of that. And so when I see places that have the capacity to grow woody perennials and aren't, to me that suggests over impact or inappropriately timed grazing. And that is the case for this ranch. This ranch was totally overgrazed for decades, right? So a lot of our pastures that are pretty vacant, except for grasses and forbs, are starting to see some shrubs coming back. On the other hand, if that's not checked biologically through herbivory and animal impact, then while we are kind of in a brittle environment, we have enough moisture from the ocean to see the increase in scrub. And so scrub encroachment is a big problem out here. And it's a sign of mismanagement in the same way that totally overgrazed pastures are a sign of mismanagement. And on the heels of scrub species like baccharis and coffeeberry and some of these others, oftentimes they're serving as kind of nursery crops for conifers. And once they come in, it's hard to hold on to land and keep it grassland once they come in, because by the time they have a foothold, it means that the scrub area is so dense and impenetrable, only a whole lot of goats or a lot of machinery can kind of yield it back to the grasses. So I want to see more individual scrub plants in some pastures and less in others, right? More of a balance kind of thing. I'd like to see more trees, and some of the have to be planted by people directly, and some of those can just be promoted. I'd like to see a lot more native perennial grasses. Everyone has kind of the fetish for like big bunches of healthy native grasses, and I think that's they're not going to be like dinosaur size, but just using the current individual plants we have and the species already here, I think it's possible to promote their health to the point where they are noticeable and more noticeably green longer. There's a lot of grass plants here that are just not palatable to cattle a lot of the year. There's some that are annual grasses that the cattle will select for and eat, even if it's been weathered and, blown on all summer long. But then there's some that are just don't taste good on their tongues, just don't feel good. So I'd like to see those phase out so that it's, what's growing here is food for something, as opposed to just like a material, like a mulch layer that has to be broken down or trampled to be much use. It's great if you can grow stuff that something wants to eat, even if it's not something I can harvest and sell. And I'd be looking at what kinds of wildlife are living here, and we get a pretty good raptor population migrating through a lot of the year. But I would be looking out for coyote dens and for badger dens and seeing what kind of, other herbivores are here, whether, rabbits or deer. And I would be looking for sort of indicators that there are hillsides that are improving in health and stabilizing, because here this ranch is kind of a big watershed, and it's not a watershed in its own right, but it's a part of a watershed, and the start of this creek starts on the ridge over there. So it's kind of a self-contained thing, and historically it's been eroding into Bodega Bay, and my employer has done some kind of casual calculations about how many tons of sediment have probably been yielded to Bodega Bay from this ranch alone due to bad grazing. So if we can see that the landscape is no longer crumbling, but actually holding on by virtue of better soil health and more perennial grasses, soil that's just sticking to itself more, that would be a plus.
Do you think you see those changes on human lifetime scale? Or do you think they're...
I think so. Yeah. I think so, not on faith. I mean, I know that there are ranches who are able to run cattle with the level of, or run animals with the level of precision and density that they need. But to get to that level, it takes a lot of time and money just on the human labor side. I think that there are changes, though, especially if we can work on that fungal bacterial level. I think that there are feedback loops that we can initiate that are not obvious, but once we get on a certain plane, then we get a lot of results very easily, And just going from bare ground to covered ground is one example. The moment you get litter down on something that's been overgrazed or receding, that's when you start to get germination, and then within a couple of years you see a major change. But I do think part of why a lot of land, especially in coastal California, looks the way it does, like overgrown with scrub, a loss of our historical prairies, is because it is a subtle change. Can be observed within a lifetime, but it's happening in 5 to 10 year kind of increments. It's visible in 5 to 10 year increments, and most people just aren't looking for it. We have a bias that says grassland is open, empty space, second to desert, right? But actually we're learning that grassland is a very reliable carbon sink. It covers a third of the terrestrial planet. And there's many thousands of species that are endemic, plant and animal and fungal species that are endemic only to grasslands, but they take mammalian involvement, whether that's humans here in the form of indigenous people or, ruminants in the form of wild and domestic, they take pressure and disturbance, and that's part of that's how they stay healthy. So here near the coast, a lot of these land bases used to be part of bigger ranches that have since been parceled out and carved up. And so we're managing differently from the neighbor over there, from the neighbor over there, the neighbor over there. On the social front, I would like to see some of these fences not necessarily come down, but have a lot more gates and combine our herds so we could get real true impact on these landscapes and give people a break, right? Then only a few people are managing cattle at any given time. But I think that kind of collective grazing scenario is, even though it sounds really progressive, it's more common in places that are historical ranching cultures because they know they need each other to do that. Whereas out here, there's so much money and we've just lost sight of that really cooperative spirit that people would rather just do their own thing and not collaborate and cooperate. And unfortunately, as we saw with the fires last year in Sonoma County and surrounding counties, we manage and make decisions on our land separate from each other, but we all burn together, right? So if everybody's managing their own way, but the land, you've got one unhealthy land base next to another, then the fire just comes through and it's kind of the great equalizer, right? So we end up having a lot in common after all, but not things that we would hope for.
One thing I see is, it takes somebody dedicated to do this. You're really into this. You have a passion for it, I can see. How do you start to get a generational succession of this happening? Because you do a whole bunch of work in your lifetime. Nobody picks up after you.
Sure.
Things can go backwards. And I see that in the ecological space as a big problem on our hands, both with land, when ownership of land transfers, and with qualified people to continue a multi-generational, more than human lifetime scale evolution.
Yeah, absolutely. We almost need like a priesthood, pastoral priesthood, to pass it on. I think there's a lot to that. And I think you're right. It is a problem. I think for one, in the agricultural movement, we need to get beyond the idea that there is some primacy to family farms, which I know will rub a lot of people the wrong way. But I, as someone who is a first-generation farmer rancher, I'm really interested in people accessing land according to their skills and dedication to it, to the craft. And I see a lot of land on the many thousand-acre, scale and beyond that's currently held within the decision-making framework of people who are not progressive or thoughtful necessarily, or even very passionate about land management. People who maybe are fourth generation or fifth generation, so they're not necessarily qualified. That being said, it's beautiful if someone is born into land, they have the familial customs supporting them, they've learned from their neighbors, they've done the work, they have the skills, and they have the passion. That's like the ideal. But I know a lot of people who were not born into this work and have spent more time in the proverbial saddle than people who were, And I think that for our agricultural economy to be functional, all things considered, to not just be functional along a few reduced parameters, that's one thing we need to be thinking about, is how do we build the capacity of people who were not born into land access or born into farming and ranching families. And investing in women is a huge part of that, for lots of reasons, partly just because that's a huge part of the population, but also just biologically, women's brains on average work a little different from men's. And there's a lot to farming and ranching and land management that is, that benefits from that kind of approach, the more easily holistic and expansive and sensitive approach. I would say the same thing if this were a female-dominated industry. I would say we need more men. It's just we need both, just from the spirit of biodiversity and different aptitudes and skill sets. So that's part of it. But I do see that a big growing trend of people excited about this stuff and interested. My concern is that a lot of folks who are being socialized in school and college are expecting to graduate and just find a job waiting for them. And that's just not the case. Oftentimes you have to sometimes, unfortunately, work for free or tolerate dysfunctional situations to get the skills to then be able to command income. And I wish it weren't that way, but land management is completely subject to market forces right now. And we live in a market that doesn't value things beyond the products coming off that land. So to be competitive in this line of work and gain access to skills and resources in the land does take a lot of focus and dedication. It takes constantly asking questions and seeking out knowledge and seeking out mentorship. But at the same time, I think having a deep and intimate hands-on relationship with land is absolutely, it's in our DNA. I mean, humans evolved specifically in this kind of ecosystem, specifically in a tree-dotted prairie. There's a reason we're often drawn to pictures of sweeping vistas with a few deer grazing and some trees. It's because it's where we came from. So there's a lot within human beings that orients us to having a passion and interest in this kind of work. But there's a lot I could say about how to, I think, raise the level of just kind of psychic intactness on ranches. I think that there's a lot of just extreme dysfunction, maybe especially in some of these like regenerative kind of endeavors, So there's a lot of growth that needs to happen there.